Hey y'all. So we're going to be looking a little bit deeper into the space race here in this lecture slash PowerPoint today. So a lot of it's going to be videos. It's going to be interesting. Let's try to figure out who won the space race. And what better way to start off than to look at John F. Kennedy's famous speech regarding the space race and who would reach the moon first. Now, it goes without saying here that John F. Kennedy, of course, says the United States are going to reach the moon first, but it's such a famous speech that I'd figured I'd have you guys take a listen to it. Try listening to the music if you can.
William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Seventh Day Colony, and all great and all vast, all companies, Christian folk, and both must be enterprised and overcome when the powers. In these parts of the sea are lost. They use the deities surrounding the waters, turn and swamp. Exploration of space no longer. But the meantime, getting around, we need to realize it.
So, the race to go to the moon. And that lays the foundation for what is the space race is, what the finish line is. So that's speech by John F. Kennedy. So if you don't already know, what is the space race? It's a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union of space exploration and dominance in space. Because in the eyes of the United States and the Soviet Union, the space race was just an extension of the arms race. Which country would have the superiority in space would determine who would be the leader of the world. And as I said just now, the finish line, when people look at the space race, is usually defined by who could reach the moon first. And spoiler alert, the United States reaches the moon first. But before we look at the United States, I want to look a little bit deeper into the USSR experience during the space race. So I'm sure some of you have heard of Sputnik 1 before. If you haven't, Sputnik 1 is probably the most famous satellite launched by human beings. So Sputnik 1, a Soviet satellite launched on October 4th, 1957, is the first man-made object in space. And this marks the beginning of the space race, 1957. So this little satellite, and I'll show you the size of it, just to show you how small it really is. It's pretty important. It strikes fear into the hearts of every American. Some Americans are awed. Some Americans are scared. Some Americans are wondering what this might mean for technological advancements. But whether or not Americans were scared or nervous, it was a technological feat for human beings. So Sputnik 1 launches or inspires many young Americans and Soviets uh, to look into space. So here's the size of Sputnik, you guys. As you can see, it's now I'm not sure exactly how heavy it is, but if it's as light as I think it is, you could probably pick it up with your hands. But that's the size of Sputnik. And it would go around Earth for a couple of months, and a lot of people would get their binoculars, telescopes, try to look at the stars at night and see if they could get a glimpse of Sputnik flying across through the sky. Right. And that being said, since Sputnik is the first satellite launched into space, I'm going to show you many of the firsts the Soviets managed to pull off, at least in the early years of the space race. Okay, so the Soviets launched the first animals into space. So before humans could be sent into space, animals were experimented on to test the effects of outer space. Most famous example, Laika the dog, the very first animal in space. She unfortunately could not survive re-entry upon Earth and perished on the way back. It was a different story for Belka and Strelka. They were a pair of dogs sent to space later in 1960s, in 1960, and they returned successfully. So the first animals into space. The first to reach the moon, maybe not in the way you'd expect, but certainly the first to at least make contact with the moon. So the USSR's first major space program was known as the Luna program. And the Luna 1 probe is the first one that successfully flew by the moon. Luna 2 became the first human artifact to reach the moon when it crashed on the moon in 1959. And later that year, Luna 3 took the first photographs of the far side of the moon, or the dark side of the moon, however you want to call it. In 1966, Luna 9 achieved the first soft landing of an object on the moon and took close-up pictures. So first satellite, first animal, first to reach the moon, at least by satellite. But more importantly, the USSR is the first to send a man to space. So on April 12th, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, and by the way, instead of astronauts, Soviet astronauts are called cosmonauts, circled Earth one time in a Vostok spacecraft. And this certainly forced Americans to step up their game. So, Yuri Gagarin, what does he have to show us? So this is a clip from 2018. That's why this is 57 years ago. Nevertheless, let's take a look at this footage in color. So there you have that. And along with sending the first man into space, the Soviets also sent the first woman to space. So in 1963, they sent Valentina Tereshkova, I think I said it right, and lifted off in a Vostok 6 for 3 days of Earth orbit. and she performed a lot of experiments that ultimately tested the effectiveness and the effect of, or I should say the effect, not effectiveness, of weightlessness in space. The Soviets also performed the first successful spacewalk on March 18th, 1965. Alexei Leonov became the first person to free float in space. So that's a real image for you right there. The spacewalk lasted for about 12 minutes, and there was some dramatic return back into the capsule. So Alexei Leonov here almost died coming back in, but everything managed to play off well. Right? So a lot of first spacewalk, first man, first woman, first animals, first to reach the moon. So a lot of successes for the Soviets. That's not to say, though, that there were a lot of setbacks for the Soviets, and actually there are plenty. So number one here, a lot of amazing feats, but the Soviets were careful to select and portray their progress. So a lot of times they would hide, actually most of the time they would hide their failures in reaching space, in performing experiments, and a lot of that would be hidden. So for example, Laika the dog, the real truth about what happened to her didn't come out until 2002. So a lot of the Soviet programs were kept under wraps, and each success was announced only after it happened. And there are a lot of people out there who believe that perhaps Yuri Gagarin's footage on his way to Earth is just a recreation of what happened because they weren't sure if he was going to survive in space, but that's a story for another day. And a lot of people believe that also a lot of Soviets might have been lost in space, but I think we're venturing into conspiracy theory fields out there. So, nevertheless, accidents in the latter half of the 1960s forced Soviets to cut back on their cost. Soyuz 1 in 1967 represents one of the first major setbacks the Soviets had to face, and ultimately that would lead to the tide being turned in the space race. So here's Soyuz 1. Or maybe not. Okay. Setbacks continued. So the Americans in the meantime, and we couldn't see the Soyuz 1 accident, but essentially there was a cosmonaut who was returning from in Earth orbit, came back. There was clearly a mishap in the reentry. The engine caught fire, landed, crashed. Everything was burned to a crisp, including the cosmonaut. And the Soviets had to rethink their program. So a lot of the funding was cut back for the Soviets. But at the same time, in 1967/1968, the Americans were significantly stepping up their advancements in what comes to be known as the Apollo program, and more specifically, the impact of Apollo 8, which we'll look at in a little bit here. And like I was saying in the slide before, a lot of reports of accidental deaths begin to emerge from the USSR. Unannounced deaths upon reentry, cosmonauts being lost in space. So perhaps maybe the Soviets were a little bit cheeky in how they were reporting their successes. Right. But anyways, that's the USSR experience. Clearly, if you've noticed, you saw that at least for the first 6-7 years of the space race, the Soviets were on an upward trend. By the time the Soyuz 1 accident happens in 1967, there's kind of a tide turning, and we'll see why. First, we have to look at the US perspective of the space race. So, 1958, 1 year after Sputnik 1 is launched, the United States sends their first satellite into space, the Explorer 1. And the Explorer 1 isn't really that large, to be honest. It orbits the Earth thousands of times until its demise in 1970. It goes well above 20,000 orbits in space, but it sends crucial information on I think, if I remember correctly, how gravitational force around the Earth works. So Explorer 1 has its scientific merits, in addition to being the first satellite being sent to space. All right. And this whole space race, it's not like historians went back to study it in the 1970s or 1980s. At the time, a lot of the very few newscasts that were reporting on this Um, it was shared it to the public very freely, the information. So the space race is akin to, could have been akin to a sports celebrity or any celebrity, and as to how they were being covered, the people in the programs, the cosmonauts, the astronauts. So here's an Explorer One newsreel from 1958 for you. All right. So the Explorer One newsreel for you. All right. So let's get into a little bit about the accomplishments of the United States here. So NASA in 1959 is created, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It's a civilian agency responsible for coordinating America's activities in space. And a lot like the USSR, once NASA is created and everything, the United States begins to test the effects of space on living beings by sending animals and other living organisms into space. So the United States sends chimpanzees, insects, and even plants. All right, and their most famous animal sent goes by the name of Ham, the first chimp in space. So, how does he fare in space? Well, different than Laika, while Laika unfortunately perished upon re-entry to Earth, Ham here survived. All right. My bad. All right. So Ham survives being in space. And what happens next is a step up in the projects by NASA. So if you've noticed in that clip, you would see there was something called Mercury, what the spaceship was. So that was the first major project by the United States, Project Mercury. So the first manned space program. And they had lots of successes, including Ham being sent to space, but also Alan Shepard being the first American to be in space. And he spent about 15 minutes in space. So this little photograph up here is Alan Shepard. So that lasts for about 5 years. And after a 1 year gap in 1965, Project Gemini is created, the second major manned space program. And their most successful mission was that of Ed White being the first American to perform a spacewalk. So here is a raw clip for you of Ed White performing a spacewalk. Gemini and the Gemini 4 spaceship. All right. So I don't know how you would feel about spacewalk, but I personally would be terrified because one, I'm afraid of heights. So I definitely couldn't do a spacewalk, but who knows? So the third major manned space program that the United States followed all of this up with was Project Apollo. So as millions followed the progress of the space race on radio and TV, NASA was gearing up to send a man to the moon, and the Apollo program is the one that would do this successfully. So trial runs were a success until the unfortunate accident of the very first Apollo, which halted the U.S. progress in the space race for a couple of years. So that's why you see Project Gemini here ending in 1966 and Apollo really beginning in 1968. So there was a 1 year gap in which the NASA was investigated because of the Apollo 1 accident, much like the Soyuz 1 with the Russians. But the difference is that the United States would make a comeback from this. All right, and that would be through Apollo 8. So the Apollo 1 disaster didn't see the astronauts here die in space, but they died during a trial run, in which they were basically set on fire by accident. So here's a newsreel. So we've got that for you. But just 1 year later, Apollo 8 makes the comeback that NASA was hoping for, in which they send the first crewed spacecraft to the moon, orbit it, and returned. So the Apollo 8 mission absolutely stunned the Soviets, and a lot of the Soviet cosmonauts and people working in their little space department, we can say, took a very, very big blow psychologically speaking. So the main reason why is because Apollo 8 was able to capture a special image of Earth. So something, maybe you've seen the photograph, but Earthrise. It's one of the most important photographs in recent times, mainly for its environmental impact. So here's Apollo 8 for you. All right. So that's Earthrise for you. And not long after, July 20th, 1969, the first moon landing occurs during the Apollo 11 mission. So astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin are the first human beings to step on the moon. Later Apollo missions saw further successes, minus Apollo 13, as the Soviets cannot land a man on the moon. And meanwhile, after the moon landing, the Soviets began to focus on orbital space stations instead. But even then, they saw some failures, including another accident. So the Soviets could not land a man on the moon. Now, does that mean it's a victory for the Americans? Maybe, maybe not. If you think it is, I would consider asking yourself, maybe it should be called a moon race instead of the space race. But who knows? Because space is endless, right? I mean, it's not like there's a finish line, and a lot of people counted the moon, but maybe it's not really the finish line. All right. So, if you don't know the famous quote, I forgot which astronaut says this to be honest, but the one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I've got it for you. So, actual footage of Apollo 11. All right. So at one point, Apollo 11, the moon landing was the most watched, um, I don't know, television showing of all time, but that's been surpassed a couple of times. All right. But I've got 3 photos for here from other Apollo missions. So Apollo 15, 16, and 17. So obviously they would plant the American flag on the moon. And the astronauts would leave a photograph of their family on the moon. They would ride this little thing on the moon. They would play golf, sing songs. So the Apollo missions were a success. And unfortunately, since 1972, humans haven't really gone back to the moon. Now, satellites, yes, and other things, but not humans. All right. Cool. So yeah, this begs the question, who actually won the space race? Could there even be a race in space? Who knows? That's what we're going to try to answer in a paragraph. But it's totally up to you what you believe, what you think. If you think the space race, the finish line is the moon, that's awesome. If you don't, then, give me a reason why. But anyways, that's the space race. The lecture was a little bit long, but that was mainly due to the videos. Anyways, thank you for watching, you guys. And get to the next assignment. Thanks.